Long before the world saw German generals marching across Europe during World War II, long before they stepped into military academies or raised their hands to swear allegiance to any government, many of them carried on their faces a unique mark that would follow them for life. A thin or wide scar stretching across a cheek or jawline that to outsiders appeared like the remnant of a battle wound. Yet to Germans familiar with old traditions, represented something very different. Something woven into a hidden cultural world that shaped the identities of the elites who would eventually rise into leadership. These scars were not random wounds picked up in childhood accidents or in early military combat. They were deliberate marks produced through a ritualized form of fencing known as Mensur, a tradition practiced among elite German university students for generations. To understand why German generals felt proud of these scars, why they displayed them boldly, why they considered them symbols of courage, maturity, discipline, and status, one must step into that old world where universities were not only centers of learning, but also breeding grounds for political and military leadership, where dueling was not an act of anger, but a rite of passage, and where a scar was never seen as disfigurement, but as proof of character. The foundations of this tradition reach back to the early 1800s when German student fraternities called Studentenverbindungen began hosting fencing challenges not to settle disputes, but to test the maturity, resolve, and self-control of their members. These fraternities were prestigious institutions, deeply embedded in the culture of German universities, and membership in them signified class, wealth, education, and access to powerful networks. Young men from aristocratic families, wealthy merchant families, future administrators, and future officers joined these groups because they opened doors to political and military careers. But joining a fraternity was only the beginning. Each fraternity had its own colors, its own customs, and its own code of honor, and central to this code was the Mensur duel. Unlike cinematic sword fights that portray dueling as a flurry of movement, the Mensur was almost the complete opposite. Participants stood fixed in place, positioned at a set distance from one another, with strict rules dictating how they could hold their swords and how they could behave during the duel. They were forbidden from dodging, from stepping back, from retreating, or from flinching. Their stance was rigid, their bodies were still, their chins held high. It was not a contest of agility, but a contest of psychological strength. In this environment, the scar called a schmiss became far more than an injury. It became the visible proof that a young man had stood motionless while a sharp blade flashed toward him, that he did not blink, did not waver, did not break under pressure, and that he had demonstrated the two virtues prized most, highly among German elites: courage and discipline. Generals and officers who later rose to prominence in the German army had often stood in these dueling halls decades before, forging reputations not through battlefield victories, but through their willingness to accept pain without fear. The scars that resulted from these duels varied in size, shape, and depth. Some were small cuts that healed into thin white lines. Others were dramatic slashes that stretched from the corner of the mouth to the ear, leaving deep marks that could not be ignored. Students whose wounds were particularly severe often wore their scars proudly because such injuries were seen not as accidents, but as achievements. A scarred face symbolized rank within the social hierarchy of the fraternity world, marking a young man as someone who had not only participated in a Mensur, but endured it with composure. One might ask, why endure such pain voluntarily? Why allow oneself to be struck deliberately without defending fully? The answer lies in the cultural values of the time. German society in the late 19th and early 20th centuries placed enormous emphasis on ideas such as self-control, honor, masculinity, and inner discipline. A man who showed fear was seen as unreliable. A man who could withstand the threat of violence without flinching was considered trustworthy, capable, and mentally strong. These were exactly the qualities expected of future officers, administrators, and leaders. The Mensur duel did not reward offensive skill, it rewarded restraint. and restraint was seen as essential to leadership. This tradition became so deeply embedded in academic culture that when one walked through a university such as Heidelberg, Freiburg, Göttingen, or Bonn, it was not uncommon to see students with fresh bandages across their faces, proudly displaying wounds that were still healing. Faculty did not discourage the practice. Society did not shame it. Parents often supported it, believing it transformed their sons into disciplined men. By the late 1800s, an entire aesthetic emerged around the idea of the scarred gentleman. Photographs from the era show young men posing with straight backs, lifted chins, and visible cuts that glistened under studio lighting. These portraits were not morbid displays of violence, they were markers of identity. They told viewers that the man had completed a rite of passage respected across the German-speaking world. When the First World War ended and Germany re-evaluated its military and political institutions, many of the men who had participated in the Mensur went on to rebuild their careers in the army or civil service. The scar became a symbol of belonging to a certain class, a class expected to guide the nation. By the time Adolf Hitler came to power, many members of the German officer corps, especially older generals, already bore these scars. Their loyalty had been shaped long before the Nazi era, and their habits of discipline endured. Hierarchy came not from the battlefield, but from the dueling halls where they had learned to endure pain without showing weakness. Hitler admired this culture of discipline, even if he had never participated in it himself. He often surrounded himself with men who carried scars because these men came from social backgrounds aligned with Prussian military tradition. For these officers, the scars served as a kind of symbol that distinguished them from ordinary soldiers. It implied education, noble lineage, and a particular masculine ideal. Unlike battlefield wounds, which could occur randomly, Mensur scars signified choice. A man had chosen to stand, chosen to face a blade, chosen to accept a mark that would remain with him forever. This distinction mattered enormously. People often believe scars came from heroic combat, but among German elites, the prestige scars were the controlled ones, the ones earned in youth, before true war ever began. The Mensur duels were conducted with strict safety rules, padded chest protectors, goggles to shield the eyes, and thick guards to protect the throat. The intention was not to kill, but to cut. A successful duel ended not when one man fell, but when a designated number of rounds had been completed and both men had received their expected injuries. The resulting scar became the tangible record of their participation. Some students even treated their scars like works of art. In certain fraternities, scars were enhanced after the duel by rubbing in irritants or manipulating the wound so it healed in a more dramatic pattern. A deeper, more visible scar signaled greater courage. A faint one might be seen as less impressive. This culture extended into military life. In the officer corps of the early 20th century, a scarred face could boost a man's reputation. A young officer with a recent university scar was viewed as someone who possessed discipline, composure, and the crucial ability to remain calm under threat, qualities that armies valued deeply. Many promotions during peacetime were influenced by personal impressions, and a scar conveyed both experience and status. During World War II, Allied soldiers who captured German officers sometimes wondered how these men had survived such frightening cuts, imagining that they came from ferocious battles. What the Allies did not yet know was that these scars often had nothing to do with war at all. They came from rituals performed in brightly lit university halls long before the first shot of the war was fired. Even within Germany, the scars distinguished military elites from ordinary citizens. Working-class men did not have the time, money, or access to join fraternities that practiced Mensur dueling. Their faces remained unscarred, and this difference visually separated social classes. If one walked into a Berlin cafe in the 1920s or 1930s, one could often guess a man's education and privilege simply by looking at his cheek. As Germany militarized again in the 1930s, the officer corps drew heavily from these elite university circles. meaning that many generals and colonels brought their scars into the Wehrmacht. Hitler sometimes expressed mixed feelings toward these aristocratic traditions because he came from a humble background. Yet he relied on these officers for their experience and discipline. To these officers, the scars symbolized not loyalty to Hitler, but loyalty to a much older ideal, the Prussian Code of Honor. This code valued stoic bravery, personal discipline, and the willingness to sacrifice comfort in exchange for duty. The Mensur was the early training ground for this ethos. What made the scars even more powerful was the psychological effect they had on others. When a young recruit saw a general with a long, unmistakable scar running down the cheek, he interpreted it as a sign that his leader had endured pain willingly, had proven himself in some test he did not yet understand, and that such a leader carried a toughness that inspired trust. The scar communicated strength without a single word being spoken. In wartime, appearance matters because soldiers look for visual cues about authority, experience, and competence. Scars gave officers an immediate commanding presence. They reinforced hierarchy not just through rank insignia, but through the physical evidence of past trials. By the outbreak of World War II, the Mensur tradition had already begun to decline, especially as modern warfare made swords obsolete. But the scars remained. Many generals still carried them proudly, and they became part of the visual fabric of German leadership. Even decades later, historians examining portraits of German generals often note the prevalence of cheek scars. These were not random injuries. They were cultural signatures. They represented a world where masculinity was measured by how much pain a man could endure silently, where honor was earned through controlled violence, and where leadership was demonstrated through a willingness to be marked permanently. As the war expanded across Europe, the scars worn by German officers became a subject of curiosity among Allied soldiers and journalists who encountered them. And many of those outsiders assumed the scars came from desperate hand-to-hand battles on the Eastern Front, or from surviving knife attacks in close combat. But the truth was rooted in a completely different world that existed in quiet lecture halls and university fraternity houses, decades before these officers ever commanded armies. To understand why these scars mattered so deeply, one has to step into that older cultural world where identity, masculinity, and leadership were shaped long before any of these men put on a military uniform. Because these scars were not random injuries, but deliberate marks of a ritual in which participants allowed themselves to be struck without flinching. And the permanence of those marks served as constant reminders of the values they had been taught to embody: discipline, courage, restraint, and emotional control in the face of danger. This culture was built on old ideas of masculinity that placed enormous value on stoicism and self-mastery. And in that era, a man who could stand absolutely still while a sharp blade swung toward his face was seen as someone capable of leading others in moments of extreme pressure. German society admired men who could suppress fear, endure pain, and maintain composure. And the Mensur ritual turned these expectations into a physical test that young elites willingly undertook. When these young men later became officers, many of them brought those lessons with them into the military, and the scars served as visible evidence that they had already been tested in ways that ordinary soldiers had not. These marks were not symbols of violence, but symbols of inner discipline. And that subtle difference mattered very much in a society that cared deeply about hierarchy and personal character. The scars also became powerful symbols of belonging. Membership in elite student fraternities created networks that stretched into politics, the military, and the upper layers of German society. Young men from wealthy or aristocratic families, academic families, and professional families participated in these duels, not only to prove themselves, but to signal that they belonged to a particular class. The scars acted like visual passwords that allowed officers to recognize one another instantly, even if they came from different branches of the military, because the marks told an unspoken story about education, social rank, and the traditions that shaped them. When these men entered the officer corps, they carried the scars with pride because the marks confirmed that they came from the world expected to lead. For the German military, this was valuable because officers were required to demonstrate emotional control under extreme conditions. Soldiers relied on their leaders not only for orders, but for psychological strength. If a general remained calm during bombardment, others felt calmer too. The scars enhanced this effect because they created an impression of a man who had already endured fear and pain and had remained composed. Even if the Mensur had nothing to do with real combat, the psychological training it required standing still without reacting to danger created habits of steadiness that officers carried with them throughout their careers. By the early 20th century, the actual practice of Mensur dueling had begun to decline, especially as Europe industrialized and modern ideas about masculinity shifted. Yet the symbolic power of the scars remained strong. Many of the officers who led Germany during World War II had earned their scars long before Hitler rose to power. And even though the Nazi regime tried to reinvent German identity, these older traditions continued shaping the officer corps. Hitler himself never participated in this world because he did not come from an elite, academic background. Yet he understood the authority these men carried in the eyes of their troops, and he surrounded himself with officers who embodied the older Prussian virtues of discipline and order, even when he personally resented their aristocratic upbringing. The scars also created a cultural divide within the German army. Ordinary soldiers rarely had access to elite universities or fraternities, so they did not bear these marks. And this difference made the officer corps appear more distant, more refined, and more set apart from the everyday world of the enlisted men. Even in the trenches or on the frozen steppes of Russia, a scarred face reminded soldiers that their leaders came from a very different background. This separation shaped perceptions of authority and reinforced the hierarchy that defined military life. When Allied forces began capturing German officers, many foreign soldiers misinterpreted the scars. They believed they were looking at the aftermath of brutal battles or signs of ruthless behavior. Newspapers sometimes portrayed these officers as hardened fighters marked by violence, not knowing that the scars came from ritualized duels that had nothing to do with cruelty or ideology. The tradition behind the scars belonged to an older era, one connected to universities and aristocratic honor codes, rather than to the Nazi movement. Some of the officers who bore such scars even disliked Hitler or opposed Nazi extremism, showing again that the marks were cultural relics, not political symbols. For the men who carried them, the scars represented a deeply personal memory. Each mark traced back to a moment when the young student stood in a hall surrounded by fraternity brothers, listening to the stillness, waiting for the first clash of blades, knowing he would be struck but choosing not to retreat. The scar acted as a reminder of who he had been before war, before responsibility, before the chaos of the 20th century swept over Europe. It became a symbol of transformation, an external mark of internal growth, and a reminder that bravery was not only a battlefield act, but a cultivated habit of mind. During World War II, these scars became part of the visual identity of German leadership. Soldiers saw the scars and believed their officers were men of iron nerves, capable of steady command in moments of danger. Even if the officer himself no longer thought much about the scar, its presence influenced how he was perceived. On the Eastern Front, where soldiers endured terrifying artillery, hunger, cold, and overwhelming Soviet numbers, the appearance of calm leadership mattered enormously. A general who carried himself with composure inspired his men to endure another day, and the scar across his cheek often intensified that influence because it visually signaled toughness and resilience. These marks also remind us that German officers were shaped by much more than Nazi ideology. Many of them came from traditions centuries older than the Third Reich, traditions that prized discipline, academic training, aristocratic values, and personal honor. The Mensur scar tradition was part of that older world, and even though the Nazis attempted to reshape the military, they inherited officers whose identities had been formed long before Hitler. Understanding these scars helps explain the complexity of the German military leadership. It reveals that the officers who served during World War II were not simply creations of Nazi ideology, but products of a deeper cultural heritage that blended privilege, ritual discipline, and social hierarchy. After the war, as Germany rebuilt itself and rejected the militarism of earlier generations, the tradition of dueling faded rapidly. Universities distanced themselves from the old rituals, and society began to question the values once associated with them. However, the scars remained on the faces of the men who had earned them decades earlier, and those marks became historical traces of a world that no longer existed. These men carried their past with them in visible form, and the scars served as reminders of how identity is shaped by youth, by culture, and by expectations that outlast the rituals themselves. Today, historians still find these scars fascinating because they reveal a hidden layer of history behind the photographs of German generals and officers. They show that the men who led armies through the turmoil of the 20th century were shaped not only by political movements, but by cultural traditions of masculinity and honor that influenced their behavior and self-perception long before war even began. The scars reflect an era when endurance was measured by stillness, when bravery meant accepting injury without fear, and when the path to leadership passed through rituals that demanded both composure and pain. Although the world has changed and the Mensur tradition has nearly vanished, the scars remain powerful symbols of that older culture. They remind us that beneath the uniforms and medals and military structures, each officer carried a personal story shaped by rituals, choices, and values learned in youth. They reveal how deeply leadership can be influenced by traditions far removed from the battlefield, and how cultural expectations of masculinity and honor can leave marks that last a lifetime, both physically and psychologically.